everyone. I'm Sean. I hope everyone's staying safe and healthy during this pandemic, practicing social distancing and everything to avoid catching and spreading this virus. Anyway, I'll be talking about Vico's on the study methods of our time. Something I found pretty interesting about Vico himself is that he claimed to have been self-taught, self-learned, coming from just working in his father's bookstore. And why that's interesting to me is because in this, he's like advocating for a certain way of training, teaching, educating youth, something other readings we've had recently like focus on. And so despite his own accomplishments, without that guidance, he still is advocating for it. And so where that seems to be coming from is just with the modern era, the modern study methods is, as he says, it's like too focused on truth, absolute truth, and abstract knowledge. And so what he sets out to do is sort of practicing the concept of dissoi logoi, sort of compare the modern era with the ancients, sort of weighing both, not saying one's better than the other, but sort of weighing out both advantages and disadvantages for the ancients and the moderns. And so sort of what he wants to do with that is sort of say, we have this going on for us, they had this going on for them. This is sort of where we're falling short and what we might be able to adopt to sort of excel them. In particular, this quote at the top of my handout on page 874 in the bottom right column: "Let us equal the ancients in the fields of wisdom and eloquence as we excel them in the domain of science." So as he talks about early on, we've far excelled them in science, but they have a lot going for them with wisdom and eloquence that we might be able to draw from. So getting on that the former point, that's sort of what he talks about first, are the advantages of modern study methods from page 866 to 868. I'm not going to sit too much on this, but he talks about three things that lead to this being an advantage over the ancients, which are instruments, complementary aids, and the aim. With the first two, the instruments, like some of these things they sort of had in ancient times, but how it's evolved now is just way more advanced, and other things weren't even like thought of or anywhere near existent back in those times. One thing I liked a lot was where he talked about the art of war, basically saying, we'd own them, and their gods would be like, wow, that's crazy. With complementary aids, he talks about works of literature, printing, universities. With these things, they weren't too, common or important in the ancient times, right? With universities in particular, he mentions they were more, in ancient times, they were more focused on the physical body instead of the mind. And so each of those two things are used in order to pursue the aim, which is learning, knowledge, in pursuit of this truth, capital T, absolute truth, abstract knowledge as he comes to call it. And so with that, though, this pursuit of the truth is almost in line with what we read early on in the class, right? So the aim is almost the same, right? We want that truth. But with that, he actually sort of pinpoints that to be the biggest shortcoming of the modern study methods. He then gets into the advantages of the ancient study methods, primarily being, they taught common sense, this sort of practical judgment, imagination, memory. These things were sort of important for that. What I like the most about this, that we even saw in the reading, is like with Socrates, is this extemporaneousness that comes from memorizing, imagining things, which was important to the ancients, right? Like with Socrates, someone would just approach him and then he'd be ready right then to engage them in that sort of philosophical criticism. As opposed to the modern era, where people are more prone to be like, let me think that over. And so, again, that the shortcoming of the modern era is this philosophical criticism, where they are too focused on this higher truth, this higher knowledge, than the more common practical knowledge. With that, he then gets into the drawbacks of the modern methods. Again, being too much focus on the natural sciences, this abstract knowledge, and little focus on prudent, practical, sort of common knowledge like ethics. That would be more useful. A big drawback for that is that, as he says, people can't engage in the life of the community. They can't infuse their speech with familiarity of psychology nor passion. I think passion's the big one there, since this is a rhetoric class about, and at least talking about eloquence. Like, without passion, it's not too eloquent. And so that is one of the things that he talks about being important to remedy these drawbacks, which is being able to have that passion, to have that sort of energy within it. And so he advocates for like two things for this, which are going to be like philosophy and eloquence. So teaching those two things would really pick up the slack from what was happening in the modern era. Some more practical things that he talks about are going to be teaching common sense, promoting imagination and memory, and those things will lead to personal judgment. That personal judgment is more important than the abstract criticism, the philosophical criticism. It's more like a building block to it. And as he says a few times throughout this, youth are not advanced enough. Their minds aren't ready for that sort of abstract thing, and it could do more harm than good. And with that, he talks about argument and logic, since, as this quote says on page 869 on the left column, invention of argument is by nature prior to the judgment of their validity. So what the modern times are doing is sort of teaching philosophical criticism, teaching the judgment before they are actually inventing these things that are being judged. They'll sort of figure it out. That draws back to this idea of the learned but destitute of prudence type of person who deduces the lowest from the highest. That's sort of what the modern era expects from people, that you teach them this high knowledge, they'll be able to apply it to the low. That doesn't work for him. For Vico, he's more in line with the sage, which is the opposite, where the more common knowledge, the lower knowledge, can actually reveal the higher with the sage. So yeah, anyway, that's sort of just a run through of his main ideas. Ultimately, what he wants is to teach them to be able to, like this quote here on 870 in the bottom right, by teaching them this, they'd be able to become exact in science, clever in practical matters, fluent in eloquence, and strong in memorizing. And these are the skills that can be applied to any of the fields, any field really, any art, which is something he is also sort of advocating for. They need to be embrace as much as they can. And the same for teachers. They need to have this sort of mastery of as many subjects as possible. As he says, sort of like everything. They need to know everything. But moving on to that, tying it into some of what we've talked about already in class, I did see him sort of discussing the 5 canons of rhetoric, which even if they don't call them that, a lot of the readings we've had mention them. So he talks about invention in creating argumentation, the ars topica, the art of topics, the art of creating argument, lines of argument. And you can see the page number here. In arrangement, he talks about the orator needs to know the audience in order to arrange their speech. And he calls up Cicero, who said that he was as successful as he was because of arranging the lines of argument. With style, Vico touches a bit more on style throughout. What stood out the most of these to me is on page 873 in the top right. While wise men can be moved through truth, the multitude, the vulgus, are overpowered and carried along by their appetite. And so going back to the previous idea of this sort of higher truth, the wise men, the intellectuals, the elite, they will be moved by the truth, like regardless of how it's presented. That's just sort of how they are. But the multitude, the vulgus, the common people, they're more prone to go with their appetite, their passions, their desires, their pathos, right? They're more to be persuaded that way. And for Vico, he's like, we can't deny that aspect of man, right? We have the rational side, but we also have the irrational side. And so being able to cater your style to that is very important. With memory, it's pretty brief, sort of like memorizing the loci, the topics, the lines of argument, is all pretty important. With delivery, I see that more as primarily on part of the professors, of the teachers, sort of them being able to deliver it copiously, like it says here, in order to persuade them, to drive their students to take on that approach that he's advocating throughout this. And so that's sort of the five canons that I saw. There's also, he briefly touches on the three modes of speech, right? The orators have gained distinction by their fluent, broad, and passionate style of delivery in the law courts, the assemblies, and the religious convocations, to the great disadvantage of the state and to the signal enrichment of our language. So all these things have really contributed to growing the language, growing the nation, right? And so what I sort of started out doing before running through everything is mention this topic of dissoi logoi, the contrasting arguments, which is what Vico does in this reading, right? He's presenting these contrasting arguments, not saying one's better than the other, but they both have merit, validity, and there's something to be gained from both, right? We wouldn't look back at the ancients and be like, why didn't they just have a compass? Like, they didn't have a compass. They didn't think about creating that. And the same thing, vice versa. But he also, along with doing that in this, he's also advocating for students to be able to do this, to teach them both sides, to argue both sides, because that's very important. One thing that stood out on page 870 is he mentions Carneades, and who would just make a big practice of one day arguing this, creating all these arguments for that one side, the next day going completely against it and creating arguments for the opposing side. And what that does is it brings forth the equally compelling arguments for both positions and displays an unbelievable power of argumentation. And this is just something really important to, I guess, the art of persuasion, and really any sort of field. I think you're going to want to be able to be compelling, especially when you're actually arguing with someone. If you're able to understand their side, see their side, and know everything about it, you'll know their shortcomings as well. One of the main reasonings behind that that I liked is this idea here on page 870 also. Truth is one, probabilities are many, and falsehoods are numberless, right? So the reason for pursuing as many contrasting arguments as possible is because it sort of helps you parse out from the probabilities, from the falsehoods, that which is true, hopefully. And underneath that, he does mention, this comes up quite a few times, right here on page 870 in the bottom right, and 874 in the bottom right, having the students be able to defend both sides. So again, that is sort of the education part, having them do that practice. And again, underneath that too, advantages and disadvantages, so that they may attain those and escape this, right? And again, ultimately, this is what he's doing in order to really say we need eloquence and wisdom along with the truth. So we need the higher truth, the abstract knowledge, and we need the lower truth, the more common sense, the prudent knowledge. And to close out, the last two quotes I think really stood out to me, and they come from like really at the end, with this one here on page 877 in the right. I believe it's like the middle right. He, at a young age, tried to instill this practice of not indulging the shortcomings of others, unless he would like them to do the same to him, right? So it's sort of the golden rule where I'm not going to be as indulgent to the shortcomings of, or I will be as indulgent to the shortcomings of others as I would like others to be indulgent to my own. He goes on to say, like, I probably have many more countless errors compared to them. And so, again, that is sort of this dissoi logoi, where it's like they have their shortcomings, I have mine. You can't really compare them. They are different. There's reasonings behind them that make both valid. And so to say like, oh, your shortcomings are worse than mine is like not right for him. And at the end, this is, I believe, the last part on page 878 on the right. He is sort of welcoming this sort of dissoi logoi, this contrasting argument, like in the real world, inviting people to question what he said, right? I shall be greatly indebted to anyone who wishes to criticize with pertinence and with concrete reference to their intrinsic purport the points that I have brought up, so as to free me from eventual errors. He will be certain to enlist my gratitude by his mere intent to do so. Right, so he is sort of like, please tell me if I'm wrong, engage in this sort of dialogue with me, right? And so that last one really stood out to me, and it was like the last line too. But again, all these are pretty much just quotes reflecting this concept. There might be others, they might be more repetitive. He does mention they need to be able to talk about both sides a lot. So I probably didn't grab all of them. But feel free to, since this is a YouTube video, feel free to leave a comment or message me or any sort of thing like that. And again, I didn't cover a lot of what's in my handout, but I didn't really have time. So stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great day.